Welcome to the Next Pivot Point podcast. This season, I am focused on sharing stories and ideas from global experts on diversity and inclusion. My purpose is to share diverse stories so that you can learn from others' lived experiences and walk away with actionable strategies to lead even more inclusively. I share this information because inclusive leadership is a journey. It requires bravery and courage, and you do not have to do it alone. At Next Pivot Point, I believe we are stronger together as allies. Let's meet this week's guest. Welcome to the Next Pivot Point podcast. This week, I am joined by another amazing guest expert. Her name is Sandra Ruiz, and over her professional career, she has gained relevant experience working with people from diverse backgrounds, nationalities, life experiences, and ages. This includes providing the necessary support to assisting in them in achieving their personal, educational, and professional goals. As a result, she's developed a genuine passion for working and advocating for the rights of people through mobilizing the communities and empowering individuals to think creatively. Some of her current and previous roles include coordinator of the Me Wow Project, Migrant Women an Opportunity to Work, human trafficking researcher and trainer, and Immigrant Council of Ireland, and project manager with a social expertise. Or enterprise rather. Alongside her work experience, she put herself forward as a political candidate in the Tullet Central Ward of South Dublin County Council in the local elections 2019 with a fresh and innovative approach. As a part of her campaign, she was advocating for more diverse and inclusive voices in the political framework. And she's also been nominated as one of the 125 people to follow on LinkedIn for DEI and as a board of directors on the National Collective of Community-Based Women's Work. She's a qualified professional active in areas of gender, social justice, and leadership, specializing in migrant women and in employment. She's a political activist and, one of the most intriguing parts of her bio, a lover of sign language. Thanks so much, Sandra. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It is lovely to be here.
It is. So I know you have a lot of expertise in migrant women and specifically employment challenges and solving for those challenges. Tell us how you got down that path. How did you get into this line of work?
Well, it was a mix of professional and personal experience. So I'm originally from Spain, and I came to Ireland nearly 12 years ago. And when I moved here, my background and my career goal was related to education, because I completed 2 different degrees in education, primary and secondary school teacher. But when I landed in Ireland, I realized soon enough that I couldn't work as a teacher, because in Ireland, if you want to work as a teacher, you need to have Irish. So that experience, that kind of forced me to redirect my career. So I started to start exploring the area of social justice and gender equality, and I completed master degrees here in Ireland in women and gender studies. And after that, I started to, let's say, my career went through that path where I was working with many different migrants from different backgrounds and victims of human trafficking, migrants, more specifically, in general, they were mainly migrant women, and then they have completely different needs based on their needs in the education, housing, career perspective. So that's what I have been doing. But also my personal experience will play an important role in this in the place where I am now, because I was trying to keep progressing in my career. And I felt like no matter what, there was something else. There was always something else. At first was the fact that my degrees, they were from Spain, then the fact that my level of English was not good enough, then my network was not good enough, and it was never enough. So putting that together, I landed where I am now in coordinating this project, and it's called My Wow, Migrant Women an Opportunity for Work, where it was a really good opportunity to target migrant women that usually are forget, like what I call the forgotten group. Because when we talk about migrants in general, we tend to think about the new arrivals, migrants that don't have the right to work, then they don't know the system, then they do have a very poor level of English, they are not educated. But that's not the reality for all migrants in general, but especially when we talk about migrant women. We are very diverse, and we do have a high level of expertise and skills that many times are coming from our country of origin. So what we wanted to do is to target, I wanted to do for a long time, was to target migrant women that they have been in Ireland for many years, like myself. Then we are trying to keep progressing in our career to access to all different sides and areas of the labor market, and to keep moving forward. But the fact and the reality is not like that. Like, it is really difficult, and there is so many barriers that make impossible for migrant women to access to leadership roles or to progress in their career and to get a good working conditions.
Yeah, and so much of your story I see, and also the challenges that migrant women face, like never being enough. Like you said, like there's like the deck's already stacked against you. You're different because, yeah, it's not your first language, or you have a different education, or, it's all these little chinks of signals that really you're less than, that is somehow you don't belong if you're from a different place and have a different background. Whereas you and I know in the diversity work we do, diversity is an additive, like because you have had a different perspective, a different background, and grew up learning a different language, that's something else that you bring to the table that we don't have. But so often we shun those differences and send those signals. And what a complex problem it has to be of employing people that are facing those unique challenges. So I commend you for the work that you do, and it sounds like that foundation has a great purpose. um, Tell us a bit about one of the other things that stuck out in your bio that I'd love to bring life to is you're a lover of sign language. How did you get into that? And having lived in different countries yourself, there are differences across different cultures and different differences within sign language, even though we would think that that's just globally the same. I know there's some nuances there. So tell us more about how you got into it and differences you've noticed.
Well, I started to learn, I think it was over 20 years ago, I started to learn sign language in Seville. There was no particular reason, but that's stuff that really called your attention, and just say, well, okay, let's do it, let's try. But then from there, I moved to another city in Spain, and I decided I wanted to keep doing it because I really like it. And I came across, and actually there were, even though we were inside, part of the same country, there were accents within the language. So even though I have some level of sign language, but then when I moved to this new place, I was like, oh, okay, so there are different ways to say the same thing. And actually, that I'm from the Seville because the way that I'm signing. So it was really strange and something that I didn't know before. But then from there, I moved to another city, and it happened the same. Some of the people noticed that I was from because the way that I was signing. So there, I decided to move a bit forward in my learning, and I became qualified interpreter of sign language, Spanish sign language. Sorry, and there I was working as an interpreter, which is very tough. Like, even when you see people in the TV, and now then, fortunately, we have sign language almost everywhere, and you see them there, and they look so simple and so natural. It is really, really difficult. It is really a difficult exercise to do. So I do admire the work that they do. So I was working there, and I mean, it's just not only the language, but it's also the culture. It's a completely different culture, and the way that the people think, the deaf community, it is very interesting, and I loved that. There's no particular reason, but I do love. And actually, while I was working in this place in Cordoba in Spain, I developed a project And we went to the Sahara in Africa, in the north of Africa, to do a research there. So we were learning from other deaf people that they were living in Sahara, and how they were using the sign language. So from there, I moved to Ireland, and I mean, it's no, I won't say that it was a surprise, but anyway, I tried to get in touch with the deaf community, and it was really difficult because the language is completely different here in Ireland again. So, but my priority at that time was to study English. But when I felt more comfortable with the language in English, I decided to return to learn Irish Irish Sign Language. But surprisingly, I got the offer to teach Spanish to deaf people. So since last year, I have been teaching Spanish and Spanish Sign Language to Irish deaf people, which I love that. I
Oh my
really love
gosh.
that.
It's hard to even keep track of all those different between languages and the signing part of it. And who would have thought? I mean, you would just think this is a universal, all humans all over the world will sign the same way. And you found differences just in regional differences, let alone the global differences as well.
It is a common belief, but actually, if you don't mind to say,
Please.
in the north of Ireland, they use two different type of sign language. So when you see, for example, the TV now, then we have the news, you always see two different interpreters, because one is using the Irish Sign Language of the Republic, and the other one is using the UK Sign Language. So it's crazy. It's
Wow.
very interesting. Yes.
Well, if you think about the work that we do in workplaces and how we can be more inclusive, I'm curious from a signing perspective, from working with those that have a disability where they don't have the full ability to hear. What are some things we can do to make sure that we're being inclusive of people that have a hearing disability?
I suppose that depends of each individual, because
Mhm.
deaf people. I mean, I don't want to talk from an expert perspective, just from a person that is has been working with people with the deaf community, but they do have a different story. They do have a different background. So depending if they were born as a deaf, and they were part of the deaf community, they will have an approach. Or if they were born hearing, so they were learning how to speak and to listen. Sorry, they were listening, and they were learning how to speak, and then they were developing different way to communicate. And if they were part of the deaf community or not is another thing to consider when you are dealing with deaf people. So it is another world to explore. And so when it comes to diversity and inclusion and to support people, I suppose the best thing is to ask them, to ask how is the best way, then how we can communicate. How do you want to do? Do you want to use sign language? Do you want to use another different technique to communicate? Everyone is different, so it's about to take as a person instead of the whole community.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I know technology is helping with us a bit too with closed captioning. Zoom has offered that now as a part of like training and things. So usually I think what's really interesting in the work that I sometimes get to do with disabilities, although, I am usually speaking more broadly about diversity and inclusion, but what benefits those that have a hearing disability benefits everyone. I
Mhm.
like when there's closed captions. I'm a visual learner, so that's helpful for me. Usually, what we think we have to do for accommodations, generally it's the kind of the old adage of the rising tide benefits like all boats. Like we're creating a better inclusive world for everyone that can benefit from some of those things too. So I think thinking, at your point, well taken, how can we make the workplace better for you? How do you want to communicate? Don't assume anything. Don't assume they can't hear you. Don't assume that they want to sign, right? Make sure that you meet people where they're at. And
Exactly. And
depending on,
uh, sorry, and don't assume as well that they do not speak, because that's another
right.
misconception that people have about the deaf community, that they don't know how to speak. they do know they don't have any problem with the hearing muscles. It's just it's all about their development in the school and how they were, the different support that they were getting where they were child. So each one is completely different, but in general, they do know how to speak. So they can communicate in that way. It's just about the listening part.
Yeah. Yeah, and point well taken about, when they acquired, that disability too, like, it could have been, yeah, born that way, very different than it happening later in life too, so understanding a bit about the backstory, and just like with anything with diversity, get to know humans as humans, get to know their full lived experiences, ask questions that are not judgmental, that are curious, because you just wanna learn more about them. So I love that. Same rules apply with these different situations to be inclusive. Well, I'm curious, Sandra, knowing we're both passionate about diversity and inclusion, from your vantage point right now, what are you seeing as kind of like where the conversation's at, where you think future trends will lead us? How do we get better at something like diversity and inclusion? What's going on in your world with that right now?
I think, yeah, I think it's actually connected to what we were talking before. I think the new trends it's about treating people as a human being, as an individual, for so long. And I think that's something, it's a natural thing that we learn since we are very, very young. We learn how to classify. We learn how to put people in different boxes. And when we talk about diversity and inclusion, we turn to do that. We turn automatically. It's like, oh, she's migrant, or she is the part of the disability group, or she's from the LGBT group, oh, she's from oh. But the reality is that we are forgetting that they are human beings. And that means that each person is completely different from each other. And you cannot assume that just because she is a migrant or she is Black, so we put the hair in that particular box or whatever, there are not other factors and they are intersecting with her life. I have the case recently in the work that I do that we were supporting a woman, then she's a migrant woman and she's deaf. When you have a case like that, for example, and actually she's a Muslim woman as well, but now she's not wearing the hijab, but you could be like, you can put her in 4 or 5 different categories. So when you have a person like her, where do you place her? In the LGBT box, in the gender equality box, in the religions, faith or religion box, in the disability box? You can't, because at the end of the day, she's a person. So I think we need to move into that idea that we are talking about human beings, and each of us is coming from a different background, and we are going through a different lifestyle, life goals, and we need to take there as an individual, depending on their needs. We support them, and we kind of raise them. We get together to support each other. But that idea of categorizing people is something that I think we need to leave in the past, and we need to move to something else. The other thing is clear that with the COVID pandemic, now the working from home is shifting the whole culture. Actually, here in Ireland, the government is launching a new strategy to support, to bring the option to do permanently the working from home. So what it's going to do is like they're going to introduce new measures to support the right of workers to disconnect from the work that they are doing, but also to allow them to have the right to ask to work from home. That is definitely gonna bring a lot of benefits, in my opinion, and is gonna allow people, for example, with disability, to have more opportunities, and people that they are living in rural areas and people. but also it could be another, it could be a risk as well about with diversity and inclusion. If we don't have a good guidelines, if we don't have a good strategy and a good law that is supporting the right of workers and the right of people, and it can bring some damage to and some negative impact to people, especially from minority groups.
Yeah. Yeah. And thinking about access to technology and internet speeds and some of the privilege that comes with being in the majority group, the resources you have access to for remote work. So there's two sides to every coin, right?
Exactly.
Early on, is like, yes, this is going to be great for diversity. And then women in particular that are also usually the primary caregivers, not always, but generally speaking, got this huge caregiving load put on them again,
Exactly.
right? So it wasn't really like, oh, not so much. But disabilities is an interesting one because you can control your home work environment a bit more than relying on your employer to make accommodations to make the workplace inclusive for disability. So again, not all good necessarily, but those are some reasons I think to be optimistic about virtual work, making it work for people. And to your point about humans, people being humans, it is nice that people have the autonomy to design their day and their structure, and they don't have to be watched, in cubicles. Like, I remember my corporate days, it was like if you were sitting there, I had to be there at 7:30 in the morning, and I had to stay till 4:30 to, like, prove that I was working hard, and this was like this, and it wasn't really formalized, but everyone knew and everyone watched each other. So, like, the last 20 minutes of the day, if I didn't have anything to do, I'd, like, play a game on the computer. Like, what was that doing for me? It still happens
Absolutely.
a lot where people have to make sure their boss sees them and all sorts of silly games we play. In our home environment, we have a bit of more autonomy, a bit more empowerment to do things that work for us. And I love your point about all the different identities, all the different dimensions of diversity and how we can all help each other as humans. And it's not just race and gender. It's not just the disability. It's not a check the box category exercise. And we're constantly trying to force people into these categories because that's how our brains work. But it's really about diversifying beyond that and seeing the full human side to this. So I'm curious, Sandra. I do a lot of work on allyship and how to be there for somebody that's different than you. Certainly, your story to me sticks out as being there for the deaf community and doing the work you're doing in signing. You're being an ally as somebody that has those abilities to do that. But I'm curious. What are some other ways, tips you can give our listeners for being an ally? Because I think sometimes people struggle with like, well, I'm not sure if they want me. Like, what good could I possibly do? It's just me, right? But what are some meaningful ways that people could get engaged in diversity work and be an ally for people?
I think really anyone can become an ally, and any person that is willing to listen proactively, to discover and accept that there are different ways of thinking, feeling, and living and experiencing the life, they are potential allies. But also, especially those who are willing to trust that what we are experiencing is real. What other people than they are with completely coming from different background, and when they are sharing with you what they are going through, that idea that you are trusting me, that you, even though you don't know what it means, you are trusting me, that shows me that you are a potential ally. Now, the reality is that people that they haven't worn a different type of shoes, they don't know what to mean part of the other. They don't know what it means to be discriminated. It's very hard for them to understand what I'm talking about. So in my case, for example, let's say I'm white, I'm from Europe, I'm middle class, I'm educated. So for some people, it's like, well, you are not facing any discrimination. And I came across so many people that they were kind of reluctant to the idea that, you are okay. Nothing is happening to you. Yes, you are a migrant. Yeah, well, but nothing is happening to you. They didn't really, they wanted, but they couldn't really understand what I was talking about. So I realized, and I noticed that sometimes it's about time. When you give them the time to really process the ideas, what you are telling them, when you give them the time to re-educate themselves, when you give them the time to really explore the issue, then they turn around and they can become your allies, you know. But sometimes it doesn't happen overnight. It takes time, and somehow sometimes doesn't happen, and that's okay too. I mean, it's not okay, but I mean, it is what it is. But I think it's about to it's about to give them the time and the space to explore, and to feel not free, but I mean to feel with somehow some autonomy to ask and to question why. And I can talk about that from my personal experience, because my husband is from France, from the Caribbean. He's a black man, and I before him I never actually met another black person, or I mean that kind of close relationship. And coming from Spain, especially back in the days, everyone was white, mainly everyone was white, and I didn't have to think about that. So I didn't have to think about what it means to be a black. So my husband, now my husband at that time was my friend, he allowed me to ask questions. Then probably some of them, maybe they were even racist at that time. I didn't mean to, but probably they were, you know. Uh, but I didn't mean to do that, but it just was something new to me. It was completely new to me. And then when I got my girls, the same idea, because they were a mixed race, and I didn't know what it means to be a mixed race. I didn't know what it means to have curly hair. I didn't know what it means to be, you know, with that skin type of a skin. So he did allow me to do that. He did allow me to explore. He did allow me to learn, but also I forced myself to buy my books to learn more about, you know, the black history, or to learn about black supremacy and all these things. And before, there was not something that I was questioning. I was something that I was like, nothing that was a part of my life. But I think that's really important, to allow the people to re-educate themselves, to explore. Now, saying this, I do understand that sometimes people, then they are part of the other, like now myself, you know, and they are tired of being re-educating people. They are tired of answering questions. They are tired of saying, why are you touching my hair? Why are you asking me about my curly hair? And 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 I do get that. And it's okay as well. And I think we need to be respectful, and we need to respect people that they are feeling in that way. But if we really want a positive social change, we need to kind of allow people to discover and to explore. And
Yeah.
that's the reality.
Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of a two-way street, right? Like you have to be willing to do the learning on your own. Like you said, your books, your podcasts, you can learn some things on your own, but it does require a two-way conversation at some point to understand the lived experiences of a Black person, of a person with a disability, or somebody that's experienced something. You just have no way of understanding that same experience because you have not lived in that skin color. You have not lived with that disability day in and day out. But you're right. Diversity fatigue is real, and those that experience the most marginalization are the most exhausted by having to, I think in some cases, prove themselves, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where to your point about like believe somebody when they share something hard with them, like don't shame them. Don't like, well, what were you doing there? Why did that happen to you? Just believe them, listen to them, respect their perspective, empathize as best you can with where they're coming from. Don't pretend like you know what it's like to be them. Your story about your husband reminds me of, I have a dear friend, Erica, that's from time to time on the podcast with me. And we do hacking racism classes together. We facilitate those. And she's a woman of color. She's a Black woman. And I now, several years into working with her, can ask her bold questions that, they're not perfect questions, but it's everything from like, hey, I went ice skating last weekend and I didn't see any Black people there. Like, what's up with that? Right. And she explains it to me in a way that's like, now, Julie, you're okay to ask me that question, but don't go
Mm-hmm.
around asking Black people questions like that you don't know well enough. Right. Because I think sometimes a danger we make where you slip into the racist area is if you assume all Black people are the certain way, or all people that have a disability are this one way. To your point, acknowledge the unique identities of people while acknowledging one of those identities as a racial identity or a disability identity. And that shapes who they are, but it is not solely their own identity of who they are. And that's the tricky part, I think, to this conversation, where you can get yourself into trouble, and why I think people don't ask these questions, because they're afraid of being labeled the ist of some sort.
Absolutely.
And most
But
people
I,
want to share.
but I think it is important to remember as well that everyone has their own bias. Everyone has something that they need to work out. Like we are growing, like since we are very, very small. And actually, there is a great documentary in I think it's in Apple that is called 2000 Days Belong to Me, I think, or anyway, it is really interesting because they are talking about the developing of 100 kids around the world, and they are exploring different areas. So one is about classification. And again, it's that idea that we are classifying people and we are putting people in and this is happening for everyone. Everyone is learning that in one way or another.
Yeah.
So everyone has to learn. Everyone has to work in their own bias. So just to keep that in mind, because it could be that in my case was about Black people, but it could be that for a Black person, it's about people from the deaf community. And it could be then from a person from the deaf community, it's about people from the LGBT group, or people from the LGBT. I don't know. It's just, I think we need to be mindful that today you are helping me with something, but maybe tomorrow I'm going to help you with something else, because, that we all need to work out and do some work around and diversity and inclusion, discrimination, and conscious bias, and all these things.
Yep, they all culminate together. Well, Sandra, it has been so fun to talk with you today. Tell our listeners how they can get in touch with you, how they can follow your work.
Well, I'm in LinkedIn, so I would love to connect with everyone. So they can find me as a Sandra Ruiz Moriana, and that's where I am. And if somebody wants to get in touch with me, I would love to do that.
Awesome. We'll link to your profile in the show notes. Sandra, thanks so much for
very
your
much.
time today. It's been a real pleasure.
Man, it was my pleasure. Thank you very much for the invitation. And thank you.
I appreciate you listening to this episode. If you like this podcast, the best way you can be an ally is to write a review on iTunes, on Spotify, on Google, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Every review helps other allies find us. I host this podcast because I believe we are stronger together as allies.